Republican leaders in 3 states have voted to cancel 2020 primaries and caucuses. GOP parties in South Carolina, Nevada, and Kansas announced over the weekend that all Republican delegates will be committed to President Trump in the upcoming election cycle. Republicans in Arizona will reportedly make a formal decision as early as today. Among the reasons for the state's decisions to nix primaries and caucuses include the expenses associated with putting on an election when the incumbent already has significant party support. Canceling primaries and caucuses has been done before by the party of the presidential incumbent, but in the past that has mostly been when there has been no real primary challenger. Interesting. Joining us now, one of those primary challengers, the latest Republican to launch a bid to take on President Trump in 2020. Republican presidential candidate Mark Sanford. He served South Carolina as governor and a U.S. congressman.
Hey, Mark, great to see you here. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Why don't we just start with the big question? Why are you running for president?
I'm running because I think we need to have a conversation about what it means to be a Republican. I think that we've lost our way as a party. Joe, you were there in the early 90s, and, we actually made improvements with regard to this issue of debt and deficits and government spending. We actually saw a balanced budget during that time period. That has gone by the wayside, and I think that, economic matters matter. I would also say that we got to have a conversation about the way in which we engage with the rest of the world. Trade and free trade used to be a linchpin of what the Republican Party was about. It, too, has gone by the wayside. I would say that we got to have a conversation about institutions and sort of a conservative framework for the way in which the bodies talk to each other. We've lost that, or in the process of losing that. When the president goes out and says, the Fed chair is an enemy of the state, wow, we're really challenging institutions, I think, in a dangerous way. And that's been, again, the glue that's held the balance of power that the Founding Fathers put in place. And finally, I'd say we got to have a conversation about tone. You can say the right thing, but if you say it in the wrong way, you turn folks off. And you saw that in the 1st congressional district that I used to represent, wherein for the first time in about 50 years, the seat went Democrat in large measure because a whole lot of soccer moms and a whole lot of young folks said, wait a minute, what's going on here doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, Mark, the thing is that, again, we have to remind people, you brought it up, but when we got to Congress, everybody was saying we could never balance the budget. We balanced the budget for the first time in a generation. We balanced it 4 years in a row for the first time in a century. We passed welfare reform. We cut taxes. We actually reformed Medicare, extended its life by 7 years by making some difficult choices. That's what I always thought conservatives did. That's what I always thought the Republican Party stood for. And yet, you're running against a Republican president who's given us the biggest deficits ever, certainly in an expansive economy, the biggest federal debt ever, the biggest spending budget ever, a budget that even Rand Paul said a couple of months ago was the biggest boondoggle in the history of the Republic. And he's got, because he's a protectionist, because he doesn't believe in free markets, free trade, he's got this $16 billion socialist scheme to pay off the biggest agricultural interests, industrial interests in America. Like, how do you run against a guy like that when 75–80% of Republicans support that? The party has changed, Mark. It's changed.
I would say this. That's the central premise of the campaign. Those thousands of conversations that I had over 25 years, both as 2 terms in the governorship and 12 years in the House of Representatives, the thousands of conversations I had with folks, whether at the small business level where they were trying to make it, or whether you talk to folks around the kitchen counter and they're talking about the struggle that they had with finances, I believe that those people have not disappeared. I think that they have been talked to. They haven't been appealed to. But I don't think they've disappeared. Now, if I'm wrong on that, my campaign will be short-lived. But if I'm right, I think that this campaign will have legs.
Mark, so you talk about this campaign being about what it means to be a Republican. Is President Trump a Republican? And the Republican leaders in Congress who refuse to challenge him at times, are they true, legitimate Republicans with conservative ideals? What do you make of what is happening?
I would certainly see the fact that whatever Republican is has gotten a bit murky. It's a long way from where Joe and I started back in the early 90s. And it's a long way again.
Is the president a Republican?
That's for other people to determine. I mean, he's certainly labeled a Republican. I think that a lot of his actions are contrary to conservative philosophy, which I think is what republicanism traditionally was all about.
So, Mark, we hear often about his base, Trump's base. You hear it all the time, that they love him. They can't be shaken from him. There are people who go from state to state to go to his rallies. So what's your theory of the case? Is there an opening for someone like you? And if so, what is it?
I think at two different levels. One is if you look at most of those polls out there, when they say 80, 90% support, roughly about half the folks that respond in those polls say that they would like to see the president challenged, that there ought to be a debate within the Republican Party as to indeed where we're going as a party. I would also say this, most of those folks out there, I mean, again, I keep going back to they haven't disappeared. The grassroots of what the party used to be about, I think, is still there. But again, that's the central tenet that I'm going to explore in this campaign.
Governor, one of the things that Republicans also used to believe in was legal immigration. Yes, opposition to illegal immigration, but there was comprehensive immigration reform that President Bush 43 supported. So do you think, I'd be curious, what are your views about immigration overall? And second of all, a big part of the country is concerned about climate change. Do you think a Republican candidate such as yourself can believe in the science and talk about responsible measures on climate change and still get some support?
I would hope so. Again, I come from the coast of South Carolina. It's called the Low Country of South Carolina for a reason, where I grew up. And literally on the farm that I grew up on, you can see areas there were pine trees growing up when I was a boy that are now salt flats. And so I believe in climate change. It is, to me, illogical to say I believe in the miracles of science in terms of what it can do with our bodies at a hospital, at Johns Hopkins, or go down the great different institutions of our country. But I don't believe in science when it comes to Earth. That to me is a non sequitur. And so, yes, I would think that believing in science seems to be pretty logical, and there would be room for that in the party going forward. As to immigration, yeah. I mean, we're a nation of immigrants. I think the key there is, to your point, legal immigration. We want to have a system where people don't just haphazardly walk back and forth across the border. But we ought to welcome folks. I mean, we're in a global race for intellectual capital, and the idea of rewarding people who have brain power coming or staying to this country, to me, makes sense. In another sense, we have real needs for functions that are handled with the hands. Having a work permit system that's logical, to me, makes sense.
Governor, let me jump in here with a crassly political question, which is, we have some history in this country of challengers to incumbent presidents not getting the nomination, but weakening the president. I'm thinking of 1992 when Pat Buchanan failed to get the Republican nomination, but he certainly had a negative impact on President George H.W. Bush. I wonder, do you have a role model there or somewhere else? And if the effect of your campaign is to weaken President Trump, not get the Republican nomination, but make it easier for a Democrat to win next November, is that okay with you?
Well, I mean, a lot of people have brought that up as a reason not to run, but I think you got to own what you own in life. And so, I mean, this is the equivalent of saying within the Republican Party to all of those high school football teams across America, tell you what, guys, we're not going to scrimmage this week. We'll be stronger by not scrimmaging. We're just going to play on Friday night. And the coach would say, are you completely out of your mind? The American way is premised on competition, and political parties ultimately are made better by competition. I went to graduate school at the University of Virginia, and we had the case study method. You threw an idea out in the middle of the table, you debated it long enough that hopefully, and in most cases, you end up with a better idea at the end of the day. I think the party would be made stronger. I think the eventual nominee would be made stronger by a robust debate of ideas rather than simply saying, we picked our horse, we're sticking with it, and we'll see what happens come next November.
So before you go, if Trump wins the nomination, who will you vote for president?
I mean, that's one of those questions of how many angels dance on the head of a pin. I mean, I'll worry about it when I get there.
Well, it
I would
happens.
say, in fairness, though, I'm an idea guy. I believe in ideas, and I'm going to pick the candidate that's closest to what I believe in confronting this financial storm that's coming our way. I think we have a profound problem, the likes of a financial hurricane that's coming ashore if we do nothing on debt, deficit, and government spending. And so the answer to the question would be whoever comes the closest to answering those questions for me.
Republican presidential candidate Mark Sanford, great to have you on the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Up next, the death toll from Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas is rising as relief efforts are underway. Dr. Dave Campbell and some of the Morning Joe teams are just back from covering those providing aid to areas on the islands. He joins us next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.